So thanks everyone for coming to this session. And today we welcome Charmion, who is a former postdoc. And from what I know from Bruce, she's also a former president for PDA. So thank you so much for spending time with us today to share your experience from getting your PhD to being a postdoc to finally getting into where you want to be. So without further ado, please take it away. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for the invitation, Wyatt. It's certainly my pleasure to be here to present to everybody today. So as Wyatt said, my name is Charmion Cruickshank-Quinn, and I will be talking about my current role as application scientist, field application scientist at Agilent, and essentially how I got to that part. So you'll see this nice little path. This essentially goes to the Boiling Lake. So that's actually in Dominica, where I'm from. So my husband took the picture. But you can actually see here that there's a certain point where you can't quite figure out where that path ends. And so I like this analogy because a lot of times you feel like you're lost in the jungle. So I compare that to our traditional career paths where at some point, whether you're a grad student or a postdoc, you have to start making decisions on where do you want to go? Do you want to go into academia? Do you want to go into industry? And a lot of times, academia trains you to go into academia. So here we have our guide. So in our case, in the analogy, the guide could be your mentor, it could be your PI, it could be Bruce at the Career Development Office. But whoever that guide is, you should be able to talk to them and they should be able to help you in terms of determining, ask questions. Hell, the guide could be me, pardon my French. But again, it could be anyone out there who has been through this before, who could give you some advice in terms of, what's out there and how to achieve that. Essentially, especially if you're not going the academic path. So what essentially took me to my journey, what exactly took me to Agilent, and what was that journey getting there? So it was actually, for the most part, straightforward with a lot of reflection in between. So in graduate school, I got a lot of experience with teaching, with instrumentation, with research. And I went to the State University of New York at Buffalo, and that's essentially, another snow capital. Pretty much looking at outside, I feel like I'm in Buffalo right now. But I did my research for 5 years. It was research based on more biological, bioanalytical, mass spectrometry research. It was dealing with autism. We won't go too much into my research aspect of things. But during those 5 years, the first 2 years I actually taught general chemistry, recitation, and lab. And so I got a lot of teaching experience there. But also the next 3 years, I actually worked at the instrument center. So the department has a chemistry instrumentation core facility. And so 3 years, I worked there gaining experience with mass spectrometry, whether it was Thermo's trap instruments or Bruker's high-res instruments, even Shimatsu's GC. So I got a lot of hands-on experience running samples, not just for people within that department, but also within departments in the other schools, but also we actually had some industry customers submitting samples. And it could be anything from, what's in this sample to, how much of it's in the sample to what's the mass accuracy, is this pure? So the questions pretty much varied, as you can imagine, with just typical scientific questions. So in grad school, it was great. I had a lot of that mass spec experience. Obviously, at that point, once you start wrapping up after those 5 years, you have to figure out, well, what do I want to do? And so like most of us in grad school at the time, and I would say probably still now, we want to go directly into industry. We think about, making, 6 figures or high 5 figures out of grad school. And so there's a few, not a lot of our colleagues who actually went directly into industry. And the ones who did were ones who actually worked in industry before they came back to grad school. So it's actually interesting how that works. So a lot of times when we interviewed with industry, we got the comments of, you need previous industry experience or you need a postdoc experience. And so that's pretty much what most of the places we looked at were considering. And so what I decided to do was figure out, well, how do I actually get myself out there? So for anybody who was part of a scientific organization, which I would assume was everybody on the call, see if they have a job posting somewhere where you can upload your resume, because essentially that's what I ended up doing. I'm part of the American Society for Mass Spectrometry, and they actually have a section on their website with employment opportunities, but you can also upload your resume. So I went ahead and uploaded my resume there and actually ended up getting contacted by 4 different labs and asked, would you like a postdoc position in our lab? And if so, go ahead and apply. And so I did. But one of the things I had to think about, and I think one of the things a lot of you will have to think about if you're going the postdoc route, is consider the lab culture. Also think about what kinds of duties you'll be required as a postdoc. So it was interesting because in talking to the different labs, one of them was focused solely on research versus the other one, which was your entire position would be lab management. So the PI was a big name PI who was not going to be in the lab pretty much at all and was looking for somebody to just make sure the grad students and undergrads were, doing their work, doing their research. So it's actually just interesting, the different positions. So just because you have a postdoc position doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the same position for, everybody else who has a postdoc. Another interesting thing that I think some people forget is really the cost of living. So I actually had to think about, well, these are positions throughout the US. So California, Colorado, Kentucky, I can't remember the fourth one right now, but it was all over the US, and I had to think about cost of living. Am I going to be able to afford to live in California versus, somewhere else? So taking all that into consideration, I ended up moving to Colorado, as you can tell, for a few different reasons. One, at the time, it was actually, if you can believe it, the cost of living was actually much lower. So I was back in 2012. But then it was interesting because my graduate advisor at the time, well, still my advisor, but he actually knew about the lab, and it was over at National Jewish, and he was familiar with the lab, he was familiar with the reputation, and so he had only good things to say. So I actually ended up going there to interview, and I liked the culture, I liked the people, so I ended up taking the position, which actually worked out well, because the lab was not just a research lab, but they were also a core facility. And so all the instrumentation, research, teaching experience I got from grad school, I was actually able to apply that to this new role as a postdoc. But I also got to learn new instrumentations, new applications, and do new research. So whereas I was familiar with Bruker and Thermo and Shimatsu and a few of the other, PerkinElmer, for example, in my postdoc, I got to now get to learn more about Agilent and their instrumentations, because the lab was predominantly Agilent. And so I got to use the Agilent triple quads, the Agilent QTOFs, and get to learn more about metabolomics, lipidomics, targeted analysis. And because it was a core, I got to take part in a lot of other studies too, epilepsy, sleep studies, aging studies, et cetera, the list goes on. So that was actually a pretty good experience. But my main reason for obviously being there was the postdoc project that I was on. So it was a 5-year project. It was an NIH P20 project. And the P20 projects are pretty huge projects that pretty much encompass a lot of different institutions, a lot of different PIs. So the one that I was on, or portion of it, was the metabolomics and lipidomics aspect. But one of the co-PIs is a biostatistician, so I got to learn about statistics. The other co-PI was well, I should say they all are. She's still a biostatistician. The other PI, he's a clinician, so I got to learn about, how to get the right cohorts, human cohorts, to answer the question that you're asking. And then the other co-PI is she's a clinician but a mouse model expert. So she does the cigarette smoking models, the mouse models of COPD and emphysema. So I got to learn a lot about mouse models, a lot about human studies, a lot about the statistics. So again, adding all that to my briefcase, all that experience, so that maybe at some point, I can then find a position where I can apply all of that, which ended up being pretty handy, as you'll see across the path. So between being a postdoc and an instructor, the lab actually moved from National Jewish over to the University of Colorado. And so around that time was when the postdoc projects I was on was wrapping up. And so in addition to all the skills that I talked about that I learned, in addition to, the soft skills you don't think about, communication, lab management and such, I had to think about now, how am I going to use those skills? Am I going to, stay in academia? So again, for right now, I'm still on that academic path. So over at the University of Colorado, I transitioned from postdoc to instructor with the goal of, like many of us, moving into academia. So I kept on my teaching experience, kept on my instrumentation, but also got new projects and had to, apply for grants. So it's all well and good when you get the small institutional grants because you get excited. Like, yes, I can do this. And so I got a couple of those and I was pretty thrilled. But when you start applying for the big NIH grants, and then it comes back and then the response is, well, we like the PI, we like the project, but we don't think it's going to work. And so you're like, so that's where you start getting a little bit frustrated because you're like, am I ever gonna get that big grant to move forward? And so at that point, you start thinking about self-reflection. Do I really want to go into academia, or do I want to find a different path? So it was actually pretty nice because my PI was, very, very positive about everything. He was like, well, if you don't want to go to academia, then think about what it is that you like, what are you good at, what makes you happy. And so it was actually nice to have a mentor who was very supportive in terms of what it is that I wanted to do, and then helped me to sort of, work things out and figure things out. And so ultimately I figured out that I don't like monotony, I prefer variety. I still wanted to do science. I enjoy helping people, but I love instrumentation and software. And so with those tools in my other briefcase, with that knowledge in my other briefcase, I figure, well, how could I apply those skills? So funnily enough, while I was at National Jewish, one of the Agilent people there actually had been trying to recruit me. He actually tried for 5 years. And I never really sat down with him to find out what it is that you do. Do you like it or anything like that? I was just like, I kind of just always brushed it off because I always said, I'm going to go into academia. That's the path that I'm going to follow. And so finally, during my self-reflection, I really had to think about, well, what other positions, what other jobs are out there? And so I remember talking to Bruce and also going to a lot of the different career development workshops and seminars where they had speakers come in, talk about all the different positions, similar to what Wyatt's doing right now. And then I actually went back to now my colleague at Agilent and try to find out what it is that you do. Do you like it? And, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. And then during that time, I figured, well, let's interview. Okay. So I interviewed at a few different positions, actually did academic interviewing too, just in case, I found something that I loved. So I interviewed at a few different academic labs and a few different academic institutions, got some offers, but I just was not happy, did not excite me the way I thought it would. And so I turned those down. And during that time, I was actually interviewing with Agilent, and the hiring manager at the time was like, well, I know you're interviewing at other places and that's completely fine. Take your time to make your decision. We want to make sure if you choose Agilent, it's because, we're your top choice. And so that actually rang home really nicely to me because I was like, well, that's actually a really nice gesture. And so I kept them updated, kept my PI updated with the status of everything. And then finally I was like, I'm actually going to go the Agilent route. I did a nice little search, interviewed elsewhere, visited a few different places, and ultimately decided that Agilent had pretty much everything and they were meeting all my expectations from my other briefcase. So I ended up taking that position. And what happened is all of the experiences I got along the way, grad school, postdoc instructor, I got to then apply to being a field application scientist. So essentially the teaching experience, the instrumentation, for example. So I'll pause here in case anybody has questions before I go into what is a field application scientist. Nothing yet? Okay, great. So what does it mean to be a field application scientist? So one of the big things is post-sales support. So you'll actually hear field service engineer, field application engineer. The field service engineers actually come in and they install the instruments, make sure things are working optimally before people like me would come in who are the field application scientists, and then we provide post-sales support. And so there's application scientists who you'll hear pre-sale, so those do more of the demos to customers before they buy the instruments. And then there's my team, that's the field application scientist. So we come in after the instrument's been bought and set up, and then we help the customers with their application. So it can range anywhere from petrochemicals, agriculture, biopharma, environment, life sciences. I mean, this is just a short list. It can go on and on. So think about something as simple as, we have a new investigator at CU and they want to do biomarker research for, let's say, cancer. They want to figure out, stage 4 versus, if the person has cancer or not, or whatever it is. So essentially, I would come in, or anybody on my team would come in and essentially have them run through their samples, show them how to use the instruments, and not just necessarily cleaning, but also maintaining it, proper quality controls, and then actually setting up the, whether it's the chromatography or the mass spec conditions or both, again, depending on what they've purchased, and then helping them to detect the compounds of interest and being able to get results reproducibly and reliably and all the time. So that's just one example. There's other examples of some of my colleagues who go to wineries or breweries, and they actually are trying to, develop the taste of some of those, or even things like wine, where they're trying to figure out, well, is this wine adulterated, or olive oil adulteration? So there's those food applications, for example. I mean, it could vary from day to day. Some people do PFAS analysis. So essentially, it could just imagine it, and that's what it's done. So I know in a few weeks I have to go look at jet fuel. So there's tons of different applications, and for those on my team, it's pretty much being able to know a lot about a lot in terms of how the instrument's going to respond to different matrices, the types of compounds that you want to detect, if it's going to be low level versus higher level, whether the person's doing targeted analysis on a triple quad versus untargeted analysis on a QTOF, if they want to look at small molecules versus lipids versus proteins. So there's a lot of different applications, and it really will vary based on the field. And then again, if you're doing like typical basic science research versus if you're doing biopharma. So again, the customers can vary greatly if it's a university setting, if it's cancer institute, if it's government, academia, and such. So there's a wide range. Another thing that's the application side of things. The field part of it actually now comes down to the travel aspect. So again, some of my colleagues travel by plane, some train, some by car. That really just depends on how close you are to a particular customer site. For the ones on my team, we're not region restricted, so we actually travel all over the US. Some of us actually go back and forth between Canada. So I was actually in Canada the day before they shut down the border. So that was pretty interesting. My husband thought that I was not making it back, but I have so much family there, actually not have been too bad. But yeah, so you're essentially traveling all over. When I started, I was doing some international travel with a colleague, but it's not typically common. Mostly it's just within the US and Canada. So in terms of travel, if we're not traveling, so typically on our team, there's about, I think, somewhere between 10 and 20 of us to that extent. And we rotate in terms of phone support, and we call it on call. So typically we travel 75% of the time, although with COVID now it's probably closer to 25%, sometimes 50% depending on the month. But if we're not traveling, we're usually on call. And what that essentially means is that there's a call center, and customers, if they have questions related to the specific application, will call the call center. And if the call center can't answer it, then we're pretty much the last line of defense. They then send it off to us, and then we set up a WebEx, and then we essentially walk the customers through the software and how to, it could be something as simple as extracting a chromatogram. It could be something as simple as looking for a particular compound in their sample with a formula, or it could be simple as, how to build a database. So again, it just varies, and it's always nice. Customers like having that one-on-one WebEx session. So again, when we're not traveling, that's typically what we're doing. So another part of it that probably many of you would recognize when you go to conferences is there's always, some type of booth or, some stage of some sort where the vendors are set up. And so depending on what conference you go to, sometimes you have to manage the booth, or sometimes you're doing a demo, sometimes you're presenting a poster. So it really just depends. With COVID, obviously the conferences have been more virtual, and so we haven't been doing too much conference attendance in person. Yeah. Oh, did someone ask a question? No, probably not. But again, hopefully once COVID is in our rearview mirror, we can, start interacting again with customers with conferences and such. Another thing we do, which is not as, it's not written in our job description, but we do end up doing it a few times, not very often, is really just beta testing new software and software update and such, make sure that things are working optimally. And so again, it's not officially written, but it is something that you do to help things move along. And another thing we do that's not necessarily as common is pre-sales support. And so we have pre-sales application scientists and those other ones that do their demos. But every now and then we'll have a salesperson call us and ask, we're trying to sell this instrument. We want to make sure that, we're putting a quote together, for example. We want to make sure that we're quoting the right software for this specific application. So they'll give us a call to make sure that, the customer gets everything that's supposed to be associated with their application and such. So they'll send us an email or a phone call. Every now and then we'll put some presentations together because we're in the field and we tend to see what customers are doing, in real time. And so sometimes the pre-sales folks will ask us to give some presentations so customers can see, the software and, the hardware and just, talk about it. So it makes things pretty interesting. I think what I like most about the position is really that I get to see science and every week it's something different. And so, definitely not the monotony. And so, it definitely keeps things interesting. I think that's pretty much it because I know Wyatt said there's a lot of chit chat and to keep this to 15 to 20 minutes. So I think I'm right at that 15 to 20 minute limit. So again, we'll do question and answer and go back and forth in terms of discussing and such. But again, if you guys want to LinkedIn me or something, then you can send me a request via LinkedIn and we can chat and that kind of thing. But I think we're pretty much set. Let me take this. Yep. So if anybody has questions, let me know.
All right. Thanks, Charmion, for the introduction. And everyone is welcome to turn on or unmute themselves and ask questions, or you guys can type in the chat box and I can read out the questions. So the first one is from Carmen. What is something that you don't love about the position?
I would say travel I love and travel I don't. So I think that's probably one of the few things. I love the travel, but usually if I get tired of it, then, so let's put it a different way. So when I'm traveling a lot, I get tired of it. But the last few months where I haven't been traveling as much, I'm starting to get antsy. So I'm pretty much like, oh my God, I need to get on a plane. I can't stay home any longer. So that's pretty much, and it's the same thing pre-COVID, right? So some months I'll travel nonstop. And then all of a sudden I'll have a month where, all of a sudden the customers are postponing because they need to hire new people and they want to make sure they're there for the training. And so then I'll have, 3 weeks where I'm home and then I'm like, oh my God, I need to get back on a plane. I can't do this. And then if I'm traveling back to back, then I'm like, oh, I need to be home. So I think that the travel, I have a love-hate relationship with it, mostly love, but I think that would be one of the things that's, a little bit more iffy. You have to love traveling to take the position though.
I'll ask a question real quick.
Yeah, right ahead.
First of all, thanks for sharing. It's a good talk. How did you find the transition from doing pretty sort of focused and specific research in academia to doing such broad support for the sort of applications that you support in your current role?
Yeah, so it was actually a little bit challenging initially. And so we have both classroom training, but we also have you learn on the job type of training. And so it was interesting. So the one colleague I was telling you who was trying to recruit me for the 5 years, he actually set it up so that the first few times I went out with him, but I also went out with one of the other colleagues on the team. She was great. And so there were about 3 people on the team that I sort of shadowed the first few months and then kind of got to see. And our boss was pretty good because he was like, well, you shadow them. And once you figure that you can do it, then just let us know and we'll just let you roam free. So it wasn't too bad of a transition because there was that support group to help me once I actually took the position and started going out. And then the other thing that was helpful was just the fact that they do offer, on-site training. So if you're a new employee and you want to learn some of the new applications, you can do that too. So it actually was not very difficult.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'll ask a couple of related questions. So how much weight does it carry to have related experience? Because you mentioned you work in a core facility, you're probably very familiar with mass spectrometer, etc. Versus people like me who's only doing like mouse models and cell culture, who don't really have a lot of experience with instruments. So does it make a huge difference when it comes to applying for that type of job? And
so oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and just real quickly, a second question is, how much time do you spend on researching and knowing the instruments that you're going to be helping with?
Yeah, so actually very good questions. So typically if it's I'll answer the second one before the first one. So typically if it's an application that I don't do very regularly, I will actually pull up, and the good thing is we have a lot of application notes. So if it's an instrument I don't use on application that I don't essentially consult on very, often, I will actually go to our application notes, and then I'll kind of use that as more of like a review, and then look at those, see what we did, see how we used it. And then we also have a lot of like videos and tutorials and such. So I'll kind of use this to kind of remember, and then that way I'm, prepared. So it depends. Sometimes it could be something as quick as 20 minutes and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this now. Or something that takes a little bit longer where I'm like an hour and I'm like, how did we do this? And then it's like, oh, okay, I remember now. So usually I try. So what I started doing, it's funny enough, I actually created a OneNote on my phone. And so then I have OneNote for things that I might tend to forget. And then I'll actually just jot it down on my OneNote, and then I have it as just a resource. So then if I go on site and I'm like, oh, wait, what was that? And then I'll just pull it up. I'm like, oh, that's what that was. So it's so nice nowadays, right? With all the technology we have, that we can kind of just, use that to our advantage and such. So again, it really just depends on what the application is. If it's an instrument that I have not used in a while, so pre-COVID, a lot of our team could actually go. We have different headquarters. So we have one in California, but we also have one in Delaware, and then Little Falls, Delaware, and then there's one in Lexington in Boston. And so pre-COVID, you could actually just go to one of those, and then you spend a couple of days there getting familiar again with the equipment. Obviously with COVID, that's not a that's not a thing. But pre-COVID, you could do something like that too, where if your boss gave you, he's like, okay, yeah, you can go get approval to go there. You could kind of just go do that, get more familiar with the applications before you go on site. Another thing too is because I worked with Nicole at the School of Pharmacy, we do technically have sort of like a collaboration with them, so that if there was something, so one of the instruments that I work on, but I don't work on often, is the ion mobility mass spec. And so they have one there. So what I would do is if I knew I had to go on site, I would just, head over to CU, spend a couple hours on the ion mobility just to, remember where things are. And then that way I have I remember it. Another thing we have too is virtual machines, which is great. So you can actually set up a virtual triple quad and a virtual QTOF and a virtual LC. And so that actually made it really nice. So that now with COVID, so pretty much all of us got our machines set up with COVID, because we couldn't be in front of instruments all the time like we usually are. And we can just sign on to this virtual machine, and it would be like we're in front of the instruments, adding samples, making a work list, adjusting instrument parameters, tuning, that kind of thing. So it makes it really nice to have, again, all the new technical savvy software at your fingertips now to be able to, keep abreast of what's going on. Now, your first question. Okay, I talked so much about the second, I forgot what the first was.
Yeah, it's how much your previous experience with using instrumentation have on getting the job?
Oh, yes. Yep, so that one's actually a good question, because, so I'll tell you a funny story about my husband. The position that I have right now, And the person who recruited me, who were both on the same team, my husband actually applied for that position straight out of grad school, but didn't get it. So my husband had similar experience to me in terms of instrumentation, but he didn't have a lot of experience in terms of applications. So while he had the strong mass spec experience, he didn't have the really more of the applications experience. So he's more of a tinkerer. So that's actually really interesting. Now he's got more of the biological experience. And so now, they're trying to recruit him. So you can see how it's interesting that you may not necessarily need the really nitty-gritty mass spec experience. It's more of also being able to work with people and having that biological experience that you can, apply applications and such to. So it's actually interesting because a lot of the things, I didn't put those in the slide, but a lot of the things that we do ends up falling into experimental design and quality control. And so you'd be surprised, a lot of labs we go to have poorly designed experiments and we have to help them. A lot of times they don't apply the right quality control procedures, pooled QCs, those kinds of things. So surprisingly, 25 to 50% of the time, we're actually explaining just those simple concepts to us, but not necessarily to other people. And so you can see how just having that additional knowledge is very useful. So I would say, obviously, if you're applying for like the field service engineer position, which is essentially installing the instruments, then obviously you need to have that really hardcore mass spec experience, instrument experience. But if you're applying for the applications, yes, you need to know some of the mass spec, but also having that biological background is actually really important.
All right, next in the questions from Bruce. Do you think your travel expectations requirements will change after COVID? For example, will you continue to do some work remotely, or will everything go back to fully in-person travel?
I suspect there's probably going to now be more of a 50% versus a 75% based on how things are going. So for example, with COVID, there's about half of our team that were still traveling, but the other half didn't travel at all. They were all 100% remote. So it really just depends. So there's certain sites where you have to do multiple visits. So one rather than one visit, you go twice. So for me, what happened was all the ones where I already had done the first site visit where I could be on site and then show them, either how to set up the column, how to, clean the nebulizer, those kinds of things, that got taken care of the first visit. So I didn't have to be hands-on. So the second visit ended up being remote. So next week I'm home because I don't have to go to California because I already did the first visit on site. So now I can just focus more on the software side of things. So it really just depends on what the application is, but I think a lot of the applications might go a little bit more remote if it's more software based. So I know we have some coming in right now that the colleagues on my team are like, oh yeah, I'll just do that remotely because it's all software based. So I suspect there's going to be a trend more towards that, depending on what the need is and such. But I know some of us are eager to get back out. So those of us who are eager to get back out might just end up keeping the 75% travel policy. I think ultimately our boss said, our manager said, it's up to us to decide.
All right, thanks. And the next question is from Jocelyn. Is there opportunities to grow in a company as a field application scientist?
So that's actually a really interesting question. Depending on the company, yes and no. For us, it is, but it's more challenging. So for our position, you have the field service who can actually, grow to become field applications. And then once you're field application, you're really looking at becoming a manager of some sort. So you can either be like a product specialist, you can be an account manager or something. So essentially beyond that, you're really looking at managerial positions. And so it just depends on, if you want to go into biopharma or metabolism, or if you want to go into R&D, those different kinds of things. So there is a lot of tangential positions. So one of the colleagues on my team, she actually worked in field service. And then while she was there, she actually decided, she's like, well, what else is within Agilent that I might be interested in? So she actually moved to R&D. She worked in R&D for a while. Then she was like, okay, let's see what marketing is. So she moved to marketing for a while and she was there for a while. And then she ended up coming back to field applications. She's actually one of our best field application scientists. And so she moved around a bit to see what else was there. And she ended up coming back to field applications and such. And she's like, she likes this, that's where she wants to be, versus one of the other people on her team is looking at a few managerial positions. And so it really, you can move up. It's just that you're not necessarily moving up to, you're not going to be like the CEO, right? Well, you have to be really, really go-getter for that. But there are opportunities. It's just not that, there's not like a whole lot of them, but there are. You just have to think about what those opportunities are and how you need to segue to get those. But most of those are going to be more managerial positions rather than, anything else. Anything else would be more tangential, like I said, with R&D or marketing or something else, product specialist or something, would be more often like an upgrade. Yeah, good question too.
Yeah, so you brought up those, tangential positions, but I'm kind of wondering how much interactions do you have with them? Like, do you help with or give your expert advice in developing an instrument or stuff like that?
So actually, now with COVID, we've actually had a lot more interaction. So it's interesting, pre-COVID, everyone was kind of going about their own business because, you're pretty much traveling or, everyone's busy, in their own lab. Everyone's all over the country. But now with COVID, now that everyone's doing things remotely, we've been having a lot more remote sessions, a lot more training sessions, a lot more one-on-one discussions via WebEx and Zoom to discuss some of those things. And so the development teams for the instruments have been reaching out to us and having TCs. The software development teams have been reaching out to us and having TCs. And so now COVID kind of helped, honestly, because now we're having a lot more interaction with the people who are involved in all of those, new product development. They're reaching out to us as application scientists because they know that we're out in the field. We're seeing how the software and the instruments are actually being used. So it's actually worked out because now there's more interaction and we can now give more feedback back and forth.
And for those positions that you mentioned, your colleague has been moving and try it out. Does the company encourage, discourage, or?
So, well, I don't know about the company as a whole. I think they do. They definitely do. But our manager definitely encourages it. So he definitely encourages that. Well, if you want to try something else, try it out. So it works out. And the company's actually, Agilent's pretty good about telling you to, try something new, work-life balance, and they actually mean it as opposed to like not meaning it. So they actually do mean when they say, think about, your life, your family. Even during COVID, the CEO was actually encouraging you to, hey, build in a lunch hour time block so that you don't end up on back-to-back, Zoom meetings like what Bruce and I were talking about. He's like, put in your lunch hour and then all this stuff. So it's actually pretty nice that, they're aware of, everything that people are going through and, adjusting accordingly.
And here I have 3 questions from Ed. So the first one, you mentioned looking for grants as an instructor. Do you think you will be as happy as you are now if you were successful getting that grants you initially wanted?
Probably not. I actually really like what I do. I actually love it. It's great. I imagine that if I was a PI, I'd probably be just super stressed all the time because I tend to be the person that wants to make sure that everybody's happy and successful and there's money and that kind of thing. And I think I'd just be stressed all the time because I'd always be playing the game of where's the new money coming from? Where's, that kind of thing. So some of our colleagues and some of my friends are PIs and they have funding that's going to be done in 2 years or 3 years or 1 year. Now they're like trying to struggle to find the money. And I was like, I don't think I have the mental capacity to be able to deal with that all, forever. Right. So I'm like, no, some people have though. And that's the thing. That's the different types of personalities. Some people thrive on that, right? They're like, oh, I have, some people thrive on just the unknown and being able to live by the stress. I'm more chilled and I don't think I could deal with that. Versus some of my friends who are like, how do you travel all the time? I couldn't do that. I'm like, I love it. So it's just personality. And so it comes back, right, to the self-reflection I talked about. What do you like to do? What do you love? What are you good at? What are you not good at? What do you think you can handle? And just, talking to different people and getting their perspective and doing that internal reflection and figuring out, is this something that I could do and would it make me happy?
And the second question, have you considered returning to academia?
A small portion, but it wouldn't necessarily be as a PI. If I had to, it'd probably be more of running a core lab, because then the core labs are sort of similar to what I do now in terms of you have all of the different projects that come in, and then you get to do science, but you also get to do different science rather than the same. So again, like I talked about monotony, right? So you get to do different science versus the same science forever. So if I did, it would probably be something like that, managing a core facility, something like that, rather than, you know, being a PI and having a lab with, you know, grad students and postdocs and undergrads and such.
And the third question, why did you decide to stay in Colorado? Was location a significant part of your decision to go to Agilent?
Actually, no. So the only requirement for the position was to live near a major airport. So I could pretty much up and leave whenever I wanted. So for example, I live in Colorado. The other, the one who recruited me, he has lived in Colorado, in New Mexico, in somewhere else, and now he's in Seattle. And then one of the other people on my team, the one who moved around a bit, she's in North Carolina. We have somebody else in Kentucky, somebody in California. We're pretty much all over the US. We have someone in Florida. Again, once you live near a major airport, you can pretty much do the job anywhere because your mode of transportation is the plane, right? So I stayed in Colorado because I love Colorado. But if my husband decides tomorrow that he wants to leave academia and go find some other position somewhere, then I pretty much have the luxury of being able to just follow him anywhere, providing there's a big airport.
That's very nice. So there is a question that has been coming up in the past few sessions, career sessions, and also because I always invite graduate students, and one of the things that they like to know is, does it require to have a postdoc to have your position, or is it advisable to have one? Recommended?
Not necessarily. So I'll give you 3 different scenarios for the people on my team. Maybe 4, probably 5. There's a few different ones. So I had the postdoc, and that helped me because I gained all that additional experience as a postdoc, and I picked up all the Agilent experience as a postdoc. The other person on my team never postdoced, and he came straight out of Agilent, but straight to Agilent from grad school. But with that said, he had done an internship with Agilent in grad school. So he was able to get in because he had done that internship. So that's one thing I was going to mention earlier, and I forgot that a lot of the people, when I was talking about my grad school career in New York, a lot of the people who got those industry positions straight out of grad school were ones who their labs were collaborating with certain companies, and then they actually had that experience, and so they were able to transition straight into those companies with that experience. So that was the story for some of them. Now we have some people on our team who are bachelors, not PhDs, but they were bachelors. They came in to Agilent as that's one of the growth. So someone asked earlier about being able to grow and move up. So one of the girls came in, she has a bachelor's. She worked as, I don't remember what her first position was. It was just like, a lower position. And then she moved up to field service, and then she just joined our team as field applications. So again, you don't necessarily have to have that. Just depends on, if you want to climb the ladder or if you want to do a postdoc to kind of bypass all of that and that kind of thing. So you don't necessarily need to have the postdoc experience. It just depends on what the other experience is that you have. So if you're a bachelor's, but you have tons of experience with Agilent instrumentation and applications and that kind of thing already, then yeah, you can come right in. Let me know. I will recruit you. But again, if you want this position, you've seen all the different things that it encompasses. So if you have any of that, then go ahead and apply. But if you don't have it, find a way to get some of those skills so that when you do apply, you actually have that on your resume. So the short answer is yes and no. In that, it just depends on what that experience is. And, if you have that other, if you want to move up versus if you just want to jump right into that position.
And sort of a related question, actually, from Rachel. What are your thoughts on the advantages and disadvantages of doing a postdoc in a core lab versus a more traditional lab?
So it depends. So I think if you're doing a postdoc in a core lab, depending on what that postdoc is, and so here's the thing, you can be in a core lab and do a postdoc position, but never have interaction with the other core duties, if that makes sense. So for example, I did a postdoc in a core lab, but it was also a research lab. So I got to do my own research for my postdoc, but I also got to do core work. So I got to, email customers, do, help with sample prep, data analysis, see all of these other applications that could be going on. But there were other people in that core lab where they only did the core work. And then there's other people who only did their postdoc work. So you can see how it really just depends on what your specific duties are within that core lab. I'm all about, doing your postdoc in core lab. I don't see anything wrong with that because you get to learn a lot. But it just depends on, what did you pick up from it? Because if you were just in the core lab, but in your own focused way like this and not seeing everything else around you and you're just focusing on just one small subset, then that one small subset better be what you plan on doing with your career. Maybe you're using that small subset to go academia, so you don't care about anything else that's going on around you because you have this path and you know what this path is. But if you don't, then I would say broaden your horizons, because that's probably going to help you out down the road. So there's pros and cons, but I think it's mostly pros, depending on what your goals are and what your tasks have been in the lab.
Hey, I have another question.
Sure, go right ahead.
So, knowing what you know now, what is something that you wish you would have known going into industry from your postdoc?
That's a good question. Not one I've ever thought about. So let me think about this one. I'll get back to you on that one. I'll get back to you because I can't think of. No.
Right, while you are
Thinking.
there is another question. I'm
Yeah.
sorry if I butcher this name, from Haluf. What about payment wise? How do you compare industry to academia? I assume it's salary or compensation.
Well, I guess I'll touch on both then. So Agilent's a very good company. So in terms of benefits, you get really good benefits. You get you get bonuses at the end of the year. You get, life insurance, health insurance, and so a lot of that's one thing that people don't think about when they're new to the job area, where they see a job salary and it's like, oh, it's, $100,000. And then this other one pays, 110 or 120. But maybe the one that pays 110, 120 doesn't have as many benefits that the one that's 100,000 pays. So that's one thing where if you start interviewing, start looking at salaries, don't just look at the salaries, but look at the benefits also, whether it's, 401k, retirement, life insurance, all health insurance, all the rest of those, because sometimes that works out and ends up being more in the long run than just the base salary. Yeah. But ultimately, I've noticed that industry tends to pay a little bit more than academia. It just depends on what industry you're in and where you live, right? So if you're in California, you're going to, maybe you're making 150 or 200,000, but the cost of living is so much more that it's probably cheaper for you to move to, I don't know, upstate New York, where that would get you like a mansion or something like that. So there's no clear-cut answer. It just depends on where you plan on living, what the cost of living is, because we all know that some parts of the US are dirt cheap and other parts are just insanely expensive. So think about where you're living, and then you can think about, what that pay scale is. Because a lot of people think pay scale is the end all of it, but based on what I've seen, I would be happier getting paid less, but being happy. So if my life is happy and less stressful, I'm all about not living a stressful life, because then I'll ultimately live longer anyway.
Yeah,
so that doesn't quite answer his question, but for the most part, I hopefully kind of, circles around to industry versus academia. Ideally, you're going to get paid more in industry either way than academia, but you have to think about where you're living.
And sort of a related question to benefits and compensations. So with so much time you spend on traveling, so location is, as you mentioned, is not an issue at all. So does the company pay differently based on where you live?
To a certain extent, not quite per se. Well, there's a few different ways it could go. So it pays more in terms of your expertise level. So we'll put it like that. So if somebody's been doing it a while, then they get paid more. If you come in with a lot of knowledge, then you get paid more than. So if, for example, so let's just give an example, me and we'll say you, right? So both of us apply for the exact same position. We're both qualified, but I have a lot more, experience under my belt with applications. So I require less training, right? So in that case, I would get paid, I would be considered an expert versus you might be considered maybe an intermediate. So then my starting would be more than your starting. But then you could, boost up, right? With bonuses and with all those other things. So it really just depends on your experience level, would be like how you get started. So the more experience you have, the better. If you don't have as much, you still get paid enough. So we're not going to talk pay scale, but you still get paid enough.
I was wondering about some clarification.
Mhm.
You mentioned you work with sales reps, but do you do much selling in your job?
No. So
Okay.
mine is a completely post sales. So yeah, no selling whatsoever. We come in after it's been sold.
Okay,
But
perfect.
the sales reps do work with us if they're trying to put a sale together and they need to make sure that, the right software or the right instruments are being applied to that specific application. So they will reach out and say, hey, should we quote XYZ software, or should we quote this other software instead? Or should we have this instrument instead of that one? And like, oh, go with the triple quad. They want to do quantitation of, something. So that's where our expertise as post-sales come in to help the pre-sales to make sure that they're not screwing things up, I guess.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yep.
All right, in the interest of time, if anybody has any questions, any burning questions.
If not, they can just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm not hard to find. Just type my name in and you can LinkedIn friend request me. And if you're interested to know more about Agilent or just more about career stuff in general, I'll be happy to chat with you. Wyatt reached out to me and I figured out the whole messaging thing. So
Yeah, anyone who can find her can also email it to me or Bruce, right? Bruce, I just offer you. Can also link anybody to you.
Yeah, I was gonna say the only thing that I heard from Charmion's talk was that she volunteered to be a mentor to anybody that's interested in it. So as soon as she said that, I was like, all right, that's good.
Whatever, Bruce. Awesome. Well, thank you, Wyatt. It was definitely good talking to everybody. And yeah, reach out if you have questions.
Right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Bye, everyone.